Productivity Commission came out with a report on housing in Australia, and they came to the conclusion, as I understand it, that the problem in Australia about housing is supply. It's a supply problem. And I think you take issue with that, do you not?
Yeah, I do. So it wasn't the Australian Productivity Commission, which is a federal government body. It was the New South Wales Productivity Commission, which is basically the New South Wales' equivalent. Yeah, it doesn't matter. But yeah, effectively, the New South Wales Productivity Commission has come out with a report where they've basically lamented that Sydney's housing costs are so expensive, and it's true, that basically Sydney lost nearly 40,000 households aged between 30 and 40 years over the 5-year census period between 2016 and 2021. And they said that this is problematic because those households aged between 30 and 40 tend to be the most highly skilled, paying the most tax, the most productive, and that this is effectively causing a brain drain from Sydney. And look, I definitely agree with the sentiments. We all know Sydney's housing is ridiculous. The median house price is about $1.6 million. You've got the most expensive rents in the nation, which are rising very quickly. And obviously, a lot of Sydney-siders are leaving, and they have done so for the last decade or so. They're going up north to places like Brisbane, southeast Queensland, etc., in search of a cheaper and better life because Sydney has become unbearable and overly expensive. And so I do agree with the sentiment. The problem I have with it, David, is that the New South Wales Productivity Commission has said that this is because we're not building enough homes. It's all a supply issue. And what they've neglected to mention is that one of the reasons why Sydney has a housing shortage and has had one for a long period of time, and I'd argue it's the primary reason, is because Australia runs a mass immigration program, and Sydney is one of the key landing points of those migrants. So just to give you some data around that, last financial year, so 2022-2023, New South Wales's population grew by 174,000. And guess what? Net overseas migration in New South Wales was 176,000. So all of New South Wales's population growth, and ergo Sydney's population growth, was driven by net overseas migration. And to make matters worse, David, in the 10 years to June 2023, New South Wales got nearly 800,000 net overseas migrants, which was 85% of the state's population growth. And of course, they overwhelmingly land in Sydney. So for the New South Wales Productivity Commission to say, oh, look, we've got this terrible housing crisis, we're not building enough homes, we need to relax planning and build apartments everywhere, which is what they said, is kind of a ridiculous solution when the federal government's fire hosing in record numbers of people into Sydney, which is what is creating the shortage. And what I don't understand, well, I understand it because they're basically intellectually corrupt. But what I hate to see is when these government bodies, these government organisations like the Productivity Commission, think tanks, etc., always pin the housing problem as a supply issue, and they never bother to mention that Australia is running an immigration program that is way too large, and it is way beyond the nation's capacity to supply houses, to supply infrastructure, to supply government services. And in the next couple of decades, we're going to have massive water shortages as a result. And that's the issue I have with the New South Wales Productivity Commission's report. Their solution is to basically upzone everything. So basically zone everything for high-rise apartments. And they believe that this is magically going to somehow solve the problem of too much population demand. And the problem with it is, David, is that in the second half of last decade, Sydney built a record number of apartments. Like Sydney had a massive apartment boom. And the problem with that is just over half of those apartments turned out to be defective. So the New South Wales Building Commissioner released a report last month which said that 56% of apartments that were built after 2016 have serious defects. So
just on that, Leith, had that anything to do with the change in the inspections? Before that, inspections were a matter for the local council, and they decided who the inspector would be. But I think, if I recall correctly, the government actually changed the law to allow you to choose, you as a builder, to choose your own inspector, which I find an extraordinary decision.
Yeah, I think that happened in the 90s. So yeah, that certainly the whole system has been deregulated, but the bigger issue is, in my view, is that
that was really dopey deregulation, or was it corrupt deregulation?
Well, yeah, it was certainly short-sighted. So there's the whole sort of neoliberal argument that the private sector can do it better. It's more efficient if we just deregulate it. Blah blah blah. All the stuff we hear all the time. That certainly has played a role. But I think the bigger problem, David, is that when we run a population policy or immigration program that is so massive, right? You have to build homes incredibly quickly. Like that's if you're going to have Sydney's population grown by around 80,000 people a year, which is what it did in the sort of 15 years pre-pandemic, you have to build a lot of homes, and you have to build them very quickly. And if you have to build those homes quickly, you're going to obviously compromise on quality. And what we saw in the second half of last decade during this apartment boom is we also saw a lot of foreign home builders, like the Chinese builders, come in, and they just slapped up homes really quickly that were poor quality, that ended up being poor quality, and a lot of those were to sell to overseas investors, etc. So the whole thing was a bit of a con, and so I think the solution is obviously re-regulate the industry, but you also need to take the foot off the gas and don't fire hose in so many people every year. And that basically means that your construction capacity can keep up, and they can take their time building better quality apartments instead of having to build as quickly as possible and compromise on quality and standards, which has basically been the Australian model over the past 15 to 20 years.
Before we go to the break, there's one question which I think is relevant, and at least we're not like the United States. We don't have a president who's letting in enormous numbers of people. But why do you think the government here, the Albanese government, has had such out-of-control immigration, contrary to the wishes of the people? Why is it doing that? Is it to get votes? Or is it to lower the figures which suggest that we're not in a per capita recession?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't really know. Certainly before the last federal election, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said to the Australian media that his government would run a lower immigration program. So they actually said that. And it was reported in the media as early as late as January 2022, a couple of months before the election, that he didn't support the previous government's big immigration policy, and that he wanted a lower immigration intake for Australia. And then obviously once he got elected, he did the opposite. He basically staged the September 2022 Jobs and Skills Summit, where he basically got in a whole bunch of pro-immigration lobbies, got them together, and then came up with a fake consensus to basically ramp immigration to record levels. So, as to why his government chose to do that, it's a good question. It's certainly not in the interest of the Australian people, which he pretends to care about. But there is a underlying, driver of this, David, and that's the Australian Treasury. So, unfortunately, the Australian Treasury only cares about two things. It should care about more. It used to care about more. It used to care about the well-being of the Australian people when I worked there back in the early 2000s. But all it cares about is basically the federal budget and whether the economy is growing overall. And for the Australian Treasury, immigration solves both of those two issues, right? So if you have a population, and we did this in the year to September, the population grew by 2.4%, the economy only grew by 2.1%. We're in a per capita recession. However, the overall economy is growing, and it gives the government, it gives the Treasury, reason to boast that Australia, we're still growing. And the other thing, immigration is fantastic for the federal budget. And the reason for that is the federal budget collects about 82% of the nation's tax revenue. And what that means is when you have way more people coming in, you have more workers, and businesses earn higher profits. So the federal budget gains from more income taxes, and also gains from more company taxes. The problem with it is all the costs are borne elsewhere. So the costs of immigration are borne predominantly by the state governments, which is why they're all massively in debt now, because they have to build the infrastructure. They've got to supply the schools, the hospitals, all those sorts of things, which falls on their balance sheet. So we've got this sort of dichotomy where the federal government, who is responsible for immigration policy, gets the benefits and they love it, and they're pushed by Treasury to do so. But the costs fall on the state governments, which then fall on us, because in places like Sydney, the state governments then go into massive debt, and then they end up privatising everything, and then we end up with, Sydney being the most tolled road network in the world.